Hi everybody, thanks for joining us today for IP Expert's V lecture on Uri dialing between clusters. If you tuned in last week, you saw that we talked about Uri dialing between phones on the same cluster and how to actually make that configuration happen. But today we're going to talk about how to get that working between clusters using ILS or intercluster lookup service. But first I want to just acknowledge that it's another great turnout today. I really appreciate everybody attending. Once again, please feel free to ask questions at any time. It's not going to bother me at all. It's not going to interrupt the lecture. It's going to help everybody if you ask a question because some people might have that same question. So let's start talking about what we actually need to configure for Uri dialing between clusters. First of all, we already have accessibility from HQ to Site B with a SIP trunk in between for the directory numbers. So HQ is the range 1000 or 1XXX. Site B is the 2XXX range. So to dial between those two phones, we're just going to need to dial the 4-digit number. That's how we have it configured right now. So there is directory number based dialing between these clusters already configured. So we don't have to do any of that, but I do want to show you the phones that we have through phone view configured, so to show you kind of what we're working with today and how we've configured things. So let me pull that up real quick. So if you see here, we have on the top we have HQ phone 1 and HQ phone 2. On the bottom we have Site B phone 1 and Site B phone 2. So like I mentioned before, we have already got Uri dialing working between phones on the same cluster. But how do we get it to start working with phones that are on different clusters? Well, as you can see, I've been nice enough to configure speed dials for us already. I know that was a pretty nice thing for me to do, so you don't have to hear me explain how to configure a speed dial again. But as you can see, we want a speed dial on the phone because we can't normally dial a URI with our keypad. So it's important that we configure the speed dials. So let's just take HQ phone 1 for example. We have a speed dial to HQ phone 2 and a speed dial to Site B phone 1 and Site B phone 2. And as you can see, they're at the same domain. We're at the same domain, ipexpert.com. This is pretty typical of any corporation that you're going to see. I mean, you might have different DNS names throughout corporations to say, sales or marketing or technical support or whatever. You might have different domain names for that, but largely speaking, you're going to have the same top-level domain. The top-level domain being ipexpert for us, ipexpert.com for us. So, why did I bring that up? Because it is very important to differentiate somehow between these domain names. I mean, if you have a domain name on HQ and a domain name on Site B and they're the exact same, how do you know what cluster to route those to? That's going to be something we talk about a little bit later today, but just think about that as we go through the lecture. So, like I mentioned here, we got both phones set up already with the speed dials, even though they may not work. Let's go ahead and try, though, a call from HQ to HQ phone 1 to HQ phone 2, just make sure everything's working. That's button 3 here. Okay, so it sounds like that's working. Let's go ahead and answer that call. And one thing I want to point out, just like I pointed out last week, we have the call that's active, but you don't see a URI anywhere in that call because these are just directory numbers. The URI is alias to directory number, so you're only going to see the directory number when that call is connected. So let's go ahead and end that call. Switch back to my old keypad there. All right. Now this will refresh the screen, of course, in a few seconds with the updated phone view, which is a great piece of software, by the way. Which is also the software, slight side note, that we have on our racks that you can, when you do rent racks from us, this is the software that you can use to access our phones remotely. Or you can bring your own phones, but that's another topic of conversation. All right, so we have our phones configured to dial within the same cluster. Now let's see if we can dial phones between clusters. So that's just speed dial button 4 on this HQ phone 1 here. And that will dial Site B phone 1. So we hit that. You may be able to hear that, but it's a fast busy, possibly the worst sound in all of voice or collaboration. You don't want to hear that sound. Anyway, all right, so that all that did was demonstrate that we don't have anything configured between clusters to dial URIs or to pass URIs. All right, so let's start the configuration then. Let's start it on the HQ cluster. As you can see right now, I've already got the Site B SIP trunk up, which is going to be pointing towards Site B, of course, for the directory numbers we already discussed. So it covers this 2xxx range. And likewise, the Site B cluster has got a route pattern pointing towards the HQ cluster in the same fashion. So, but that's going to be pointing towards 1xxx. And I did something that's technically not a best practice to do. I assigned that route pattern directly to the SIP trunk. But once again, CCIA Collaboration Lab exam, or any CCIA exam, is not a test of best practices. It's a test of everything they can possibly throw at you. So you want to make sure you can deal with different situations, and this is one of the reasons why I added this way. So we don't want to, or what this is going to present here for us is if we try to configure a way to route a URI across this trunk, we can't do it because we already have a route pattern assigned to it. And so no other route patterns can be assigned to that SIP trunk because it's already used. If we had put it in a route group and a route list, then we can use that SIP trunk over and over and over again. But this was by design. I wanted to show exactly how we're going to create this SIP trunk between clusters. So first thing we need to do then, if we're going to create a SIP trunk, there's actually a lot of configuration things we need to do before we actually do the SIP trunk. Now, first thing you gotta think about here is you have a SIP trunk that needs a device pool, needs maybe a location, CSS possibly, maybe a security profile, maybe a standard profile. There are a lot of different things that you can configure before you even touch the actual SIP trunk configuration. So why would you need any of those things first of all? So let's go right down the list. You have a SIP trunk. Let's say we're in the SIP trunk configuration page. We see the device pool. Device pool is going to control a couple different things for us, but the main thing would be media resources and codec. Codec is very important, of course, because it's going to determine which codec is used between devices on the system. So if I'm dialing from an HQ phone to a phone that's on the other end of the SIP trunk, we want to be able to regulate that by using a region or a device pool in this case, because you can't assign a region specifically to the SIP trunk. So we're going to need to create a device pool. We know that right off the bat. And if we want to have flexibility in our codec, we need to create a region as well. And now going down the line, we want to be able to take calls from that trunk. So we want to, if you have CSSs and partitions configured in your design, like we had talked about before, you need to have those configured. It's a really good idea. You need to have a CSS assigned to your trunk as well in order to access those directory numbers or anything else that's on the system that you want another system to access. Also, you're going to need a non-secure SIP trunk or a SIP trunk security profile. A lot of the times you use the non-secure SIP trunk profile. But let's go ahead and create a separate one for this trunk, and I'll show you why in a minute. And also the standard SIP profile for the SIP trunk. There's a lot of different options you can set in these parameters. So it's a good idea to create one per trunk. A lot of times you're just going to use the standard and non-secure, but you'll never know. There's a lot of options that are kind of hidden in there that you might want to change at some point. So first things first though, let's create a device pool that's going to be assigned to this SIP trunk. So if I go to System and Device Pool, let me get out of the way. And click the Find button. We have 3 device pools already in the system, but we're going to take this SB SIP device pool, which is assigned to the current SIP trunk that's on the system, and we're going to copy it and assign it to our new SIP trunk we're creating. So let's take this guy. As you can see, it's only one member assigned to the SIP trunk. Copy it, and let's make the name. Now, something I want to discuss here quickly too is the name that I use, and this is just something that I do, but it might be useful for you as well, is I use the name that's going to connect to the end system. So let's say that I have a SIP trunk to Site B, which is exactly what we're configuring right now. I want to say Site B SIP device pool, like DP or region, REG, or location, LOC, or trunk, just spell out trunk. It's going to have different suffix, but it's going to have the same, like meat and potatoes name that you're going to put in there. So if you keep those straight, then it's going to save you a lot of time later because you're going to know exactly what goes where. So in this case, we're going to say site B because it's pointing towards site B. We're going to be using URIs, so this is URI, and it's going to be pointing to our SIP trunk, so it's a SIP, and then underscore DP for device pool. That's just the way I do it. It makes sense to me. You can do it whatever way makes sense to you, but I do recommend that you remain consistent if possible. All right, we've got our call manager group assigned there, the date time group that we also have here, and then region. We forgot to create a region. So it's okay, we can save the device pool configuration page, create a region, and come back and change it. Nothing else is really important here for right now, so let's go ahead and click save. And as you can see, it has 0 members, which of course is, accurate because we've just created it. So let's go to the system, region information, and region menu. Click find, you can see that we only have a couple regions configured here. Let's add a new one, and let's call it site B underscore URI. And you can see this device pool one comes up that we just created. And it's probably not going to do that in the CCI lab exam and make your life easy, but like I said, we want to use the same name, but just change the suffix. And that way it's a lot easier to remember. So we have site B URI SIP underscore region. Save that guy. Let's go back to device pool. All right, now we've gone ahead and changed the region. Let's save it. Now all is right with the world. We have the device pool configured. Everything is saved. We're good to go. Now we can configure our SIP trunk, right? No, we can't. We've got a couple other things to configure here. So let's think about what we talked about. We have device pool, and we're also going to have what? Can anybody tell me? Right, partitions and CSSs. We talked about that for sure. Somebody had just said CSS. Good, you're paying attention. You know that the CSS and partitions are crazy important for this exam. So we've got that configured already, actually. I pre-configured that for us. Anything else that we want to discuss there? Okay, security profile. We can take a look at that. So we need a SIP trunk security profile. So we can go to System, Security, and SIP trunk security profile. As you can see, we have the default profiles in here. We got a non-secure SIP conference bridge and a non-secure SIP trunk profile. Let's click on the non-secure SIP trunk profile, and let's take a look in here. Now, this is something I wanted to touch on a little bit, is we already have a SIP trunk configured to site B. Now, are we going to be able to create another SIP trunk to the same cluster? Well, no responses to that one, so I'm just going to tell you the answer. The answer is no, you can't create another SIP trunk to the same cluster on the same port. So the reason that we're in this page right now, the SIP trunk security profile, is because, first of all, John suggested that, but second of all, we're here to configure the port number that is going to be able to accept on the SIP trunk, so the incoming port. We've already got a connection on port 5060 to site B, and there's already an incoming connection on port 5060 from site B. So we need to configure a different port. So let's take a look and see what we need to do here. It's 5060. We can just choose a random port, let's say 5088. So we've changed our incoming port. And actually, what we should probably do, because this is going to screw up a lot of things, is copy this configuration first. We need to make a copy so we're not saving on the original non-secure profile, because that'll change the profile for every SIP trunk you have configured in the system. And one of my former instructors back in the day called that a resume generating event, because you would definitely be fired for that one. So let's copy that one. just to make sure we don't have to generate a resume. And let's name it with the port number at the end. So that way we kind of know which port we're talking about. And change the incoming port to 5088. And we'll save that. All right, now we can go to our SIP trunk. One more thing. We have to configure one more thing before we actually get there. The SIP profile is also important. We can oftentimes use the standard SIP profile, but in this case, we're going to be using a different SIP profile. So if we go to Device, Device Settings, in SIP Profile, let's click Find and see what we got. All right, we have the standard SIP profile here. We have one for VCS and one for telepresence. We're going to use a standard SIP profile for this trunk. And I'm not going to go through all the settings here, but I will go through the one that's going to be important for us. First of all, to avoid that resume generating event, let's copy it. And the important thing that we're going to need to put on this page, or the setting that we're going to need to select here, has to do with URIs, and that is going to be use fully qualified domain name in SIP requests. Think about what we're doing. We're actually, we have a domain at the end of our URI. So if we don't put that fully qualified domain name, we may miss something. So if we don't have that selected, the call may not work correctly. So let's click the box here, use fully qualified domain name in SIP requests. We have the standard SIP profile. Let's actually name that something that's recognizable, like FQDN, fully qualified domain name, and click Save. And now we are finally ready to configure our SIP trunk. We've waited a long time for this. So let's go to Device and Trunk, add our new trunk, select SIP, and it's going to default the profile to SIP, of course, and the trunk service type to none. Now we can name our device. And like we showed in the device pool in the region, we want to name that something that's consistent. So SB, URI, and you can see our device pool and region come up here to validate that we're right. And we selected region, so let's go ahead and change that to trunk. Now we can select the device pool that we've already configured on the system, which is going to be SB, URI, SIP device pool. Now let's scroll down and let's set our calling search space to gateway trunk CSS, which is going to, like I mentioned before, contain internal directory numbers and other things like that. So we're going to set our significant digits to all. Now in the outbound calls section, there's a very important parameter that we need to set as well. Can anybody tell me what that is, just by looking at it here? Okay, a couple of good guesses there, but we're going to be changing the calling and connected party info format parameter, and the reason why is because right now it says deliver DN only in the connected party. So we want to be able to deliver URI and DN in the connected party if available. That's going to be important for the display if you're using the URI as the primary source of communication. So let's go ahead and select that. Deliver URI and DN in connected party if available. And we're going to go ahead now and set our destination address, which is going to be the Site B publisher cluster. And like I mentioned before, the important part of the configuration here is since we already have a SIP trunk configured, we need to forward it to a different port, and we've chosen port 5088 for that. So let's make that destination port 5088. Also, the last two things here, we're going to configure our SIP trunk security profile. Select the one we've already configured, which is 5088. That's to accept incoming calls on that port. And lastly, we're going to configure our SIP profile to use the fully qualified domain name. And that should be it right there. So let's click the Save button. Click OK there. And of course, since the add was successful, let's go ahead and reset the trunk. First thing you should do after you create a SIP trunk. You'd be surprised how many things you forget when you're under pressure. I think it was in one of my CCI voice attempts, I had not reset the H323 trunk that I was configuring to a gatekeeper, and I was pulling my hair out. But something as simple as a reset could have saved me about 20 minutes. So always reset your trunk is the moral of the story there. All right, now we have our URI SIP trunk configured, and I've gone ahead and configured that on the Site B cluster as well, just to save us a little bit of time. So I have the HQ URI SIP trunk configured as well. So we have Site B and HQ. All right, so what's the next thing we have to do? We have to somehow get ILS to replicate these directory numbers between clusters and share these directory numbers if we're going to use ILS. So like I mentioned, we're going to need to try to differentiate between the domains somehow, because you saw in the phones we actually have, let me pull those up real quick. We have IPexpert.com as the domain for each of these phones. So we need to somehow differentiate between those two in order to route it to the correct cluster. If I just use the domain name, it won't know what cluster to go to. So let's pull that up. Where do we go here? There it is. Okay. So you do this by creating a route string to a cluster, and you're also going to be using your directory URIs here in order to configure the intercluster services. So intercluster directory URI configuration is where you want to go, which was under call routing. Sorry, intercluster directory URI and intercluster directory URI configuration. In order to successfully exchange these catalogs with another cluster, you need to check this box that's configured here. So if we check the box and we have, move down here, check the box, and we have the ability to add a route string. Now, many of you have never configured a route string before. This doesn't make any sense. Why do we need a route string? Let's try to differentiate ourselves here. We're on the HQ cluster, and if another cluster sees our directory URI, how do they know where it's from? How do they know where it goes to when they actually get that synced on their end? So maybe a good idea to do is make it location based, make it physical location based. So we have this cluster that's the HQ cluster that's located in our topology is in San Jose, and we have the Site B cluster in our topology is in Chicago. So we can say the route string is HQ for the HQ cluster. We'll say San Jose dot San Jose dot CA dot US. That's pretty descriptive of the location. So when another cluster gets that directory URI synchronization from HQ, it's going to say, oh, okay, this is from San Jose. This is the directory numbers from, or the URIs from San Jose. So now we've set HQ to exchange directory URI catalogs with any other remote cluster that it's connected to using this route string, hq.sanjose.ca.us. So if we hit save here, that's a quick little update successful. Let's do the same thing on Site B. So we go to call routing, intercluster directory URI, intercluster directory URI configuration. Let's click the exchange directory URI catalogs again, and this time we're going to be using a route string that represents the Site B cluster. So it's going to be Site B, or SB, dot Chicago, dot IL, dot US. So now when HQ gets those directory numbers or URIs synchronized on their end, it's going to use this route string here. So we'll click Save, and we see that the update is successful. So great. So now we have the ability to exchange these catalogs, but how do we actually do it? It's not going to go over that SIP trunk. That's only going to be used for actually routing the call. So we need to have some way of synchronizing these URIs. So we're going to go on the HQ cluster to Advanced Features and ILS Configuration. right now you can see here it's set for standalone cluster mode. Now, the standalone cluster, it's not going to synchronize with anything. I mean, that's kind of what a standalone cluster does. You also have the option here of hub cluster and spoke cluster. A hub cluster is technically supposed to be used for some type of aggregating device like Session Management Edition cluster, SME. Or you can designate it with as another cluster in your system somewhere. But it's supposed to be some type of hub cluster. That's why it's called hub cluster here. You can also create a spoke cluster, which logically speaking would be just another site off of that hub. So if you had 8 different clusters in North America and you wanted to aggregate a dial plan using SME, you might do that by putting SME to the hub cluster setting and then synchronizing all the directory URIs that way. So let's go ahead and actually create this as a hub cluster. So if we change the role there to hub cluster, and since this is a lab, let's change this synchronization time from 10 minutes to 1 minute, speed things up a little bit. And you have the option here of using TLS certificates, which is great, a great security feature. But in the interest of time here, let's just go ahead and make this password based. So if we select the radio button here to use password, we'll just make that IP expert. That's a pretty tough one to guess, I know. All right, that's it. So we hit save. And when we do, it's going to pop up with this window here for us to register to another ILS cluster. If we leave this blank, then we don't have to register anywhere. And this checkbox here is pretty important. Activate the intercluster lookup service on all nodes in the cluster. So we want to do that. Actually, let's go ahead and leave that off. Let's just run this on the publishers for now. So if we click OK, that means we're not connecting to any other cluster in the system for right now. And we're going to click OK to change the authentication method here. And Firefox asked me to remember a password. We're going to ignore that. And basically what this is doing now, it's activating the service, it's restarting the ILS service in Unified Serviceability, and it's starting this configuration of the hub cluster. And it'll pop up here in a second and it'll say, this is now ready to be connected or whatever. Let's look here. We started the intercluster lookup service on 10.8.93.11, which is our publisher server at HQ. It's ready, and it's found one hub cluster. So if we scroll down, you can see here, let me just get out of the way a little bit. You can see you have the HQ cluster, it's the local cluster, and you see that it's a hub, and you see the route string that we configured, hq.sanjose.ca.us. And the URI data synchronization status is up to date. And of course it's up to date because it's local. It doesn't have to synchronize anything. So let's go ahead now, and since this is configured as a hub cluster, let's configure site B as a spoke cluster. Let's go over to site B and go to ILS configuration there. And this is also set to standalone cluster, like the hub cluster was set, or like the HQ cluster was set to. Let's change that to spoke. Change the synchronization time here to 1 minute again. And we'll use the ultra secure password of IP expert. All right, now this is going to pop up that window that's going to connect. It's going to ask you to connect to a different cluster. And this time we're actually going to put something in the window. We're going to connect to this publisher server that's running the HQ cluster. So let's put that address in there, 10.8.93.11. We'll click OK. And it's going to need to restart the ILS service to make that happen, which is fine. All right. So that's going to take just a second to register there. Once it comes up with the configuration page that's saved, it's going to take just a second, and then it's going to try and synchronize those directory URIs. So what we can do in the meantime, while we're waiting for this page to save and everything to load and all that, we can configure the SIP route pattern. And this is going to be necessary for us to get those URIs from cluster to cluster. So like I mentioned, we can't use a domain name to differentiate between clusters because they have the same domain name. So that's why we created these route strings. So if we go into SIP route pattern and create a route string type pattern pointing to the other cluster, then we're able to dial. So let's go ahead and do that. Move back in the right hand corner here. And okay, so it looks like the service was restarted. It's ready, and it did not find any hub clusters yet, by the way. So it's just going to take, actually should take only about a minute since that's what we set here. But in the meantime, let's go to HQ cluster and go to call routing and SIP route pattern. Click find here, and we don't have any route patterns in the system. Let's add new, and we're going to use domain routing. And this is a little bit confusing here. You see you have IPv4 pattern under this domain routing drop down. It doesn't really make any sense because, yeah, it could be an IPv4 pattern that you're putting in there, but it's in this case, it's going to be a domain-based pattern or a route string-based pattern. So it's not very descriptive field, so don't let that throw you off. So from the HQ cluster, we're going to connect to the site B cluster, of course, so we need to put that site B route string in there. So this was site B, or sb.chicago.il for Illinois.us. All right, so we've got that route string in there. Now what? The route partition, my favorite subject. So you can change this, of course, which I recommend doing. Let's just go ahead and put this in the internal partition for now. That way everybody's got access to it that needs it. And we can either do a SIP trunk or a route list. I'm going to go against best practices yet again here and just assign the SIP trunk directly to the SIP route pattern, just for illustrative purposes. And so we have a lot of trunks to select from here. So we're going to have the Site B URI SIP trunk, which is the one we created for Uri dialing purposes. And there's nothing else that we need to configure here. So let's click the Save button. Now we see that actually all changed this to the lowercase here for the pattern. And we've got our domain routing pattern configured in the system now. So anything else we need to do here? I don't think so. Let's go ahead and go to Site B and go to Call Routing, SIP Route Pattern. Let's click Find, and obviously we don't have anything here either. All right, so we have domain routing again, and we're going to create our pattern, which is going to be our SIP route string to the HQ cluster here. So hq.sanjose.ca.us. All right, now we're going to also put this one in the internal partition. And we're going to select our HQ URI SIP trunk. Assign it directly to the trunk again. Nothing else we need there. So those are the two things that we actually need to do. We have those route patterns configured on both clusters. So now let's go ahead and check on our ILS status. Let's go to the hub cluster, which is HQ, and go to Advanced Features, ILS Configuration. And now you see that it's found one hub cluster and one spoke cluster. Spoke cluster obviously being the Site B cluster in this case, since we configure that. So if you scroll down here, I'm going to have to get out of the way again. Scroll down here, you can see the HQ cluster, of course, because that's the hub cluster that we have configured. If you expand that down here, the little arrow down there, you can see under that hub cluster is now going to be this Site B cluster, the SB cluster that we've configured to be a spoke. And you can see that it has a last contact time, it has a role in the network, which shows up as spoke, and it also has the cluster URI route string, which is sb.chicago.il.us. It shows a last URI data received, and also the fact that it's up to date, which is probably the most important part of this. I mean, you have, if you can see right here, just sneak in there, it's up to date. So that's a great thing, because now we can actually try to make a call between clusters. So let's pull up our phones. And where should we go here? Let's go from HQ phone 1 to Site B phone 2, which is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth button. So we select that phone, and let's make sure we have automatic screenshots enabled on all these guys. We do. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fifth button, we have the HQ phone 1 selected. Let's go ahead and make that call. And you can hear that that's ringing over here. And let's go ahead and pick it up. And the call is now active between these two phones. We've successfully made a URI call between clusters. Once again, that's going to show up as just the directory numbers here, because URI is just going to be an alias to these directory numbers. So we've made that call between systems. Let's go ahead and test another call. Let's go from the 9971 phone to the 9971 phone is the HQ phone 2, and we'll go to Site B phone 1. So I got to change the keypad for that. And that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Should be fifth one. And it is. I was looking physically at the phone there. All right. So if I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I click that, it is now dialing to Site B phone 2. Let's change the keypad. And just click answer. And now when the phones refresh, you'll see that they're connected here. Great. So obviously that phone is connected with 1000, with 1002. We had a call from HQ phone 2 to Site B phone 2. All right. So with that said, that is the entirety of the Uri dialing configuration and section. And so I guess I'll go ahead and turn it over and ask if you guys have any questions. I see actually there's a couple queued up already. Sorry I missed those. But we have the first question here from Scott. Scott asks, do I have to configure the route string to dial between clusters? Well, in this case, you don't ever have to do anything, really. Look at it that way. You don't have to configure a route string to dial between clusters. You can actually use a wildcard pattern if you want. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let's go back to HQ and look at the SIP route pattern that we created. And if we want to use, we have sb.chicago.il.us. We have that exact route string here. We don't have to configure that technically. We can configure a wildcard pattern. So if I just said asterisk, that means everything. So we're going to send every SIP route pattern out this SB URI SIP trunk. If you really wanted to do that, you could set that. So now this says update successful here. So let's go ahead and try a test call there this is from HQ to Site B. So an HQ phone should technically be able to still call using this wildcard pattern. Let's go with HQ. Let me end this call here. So if I want HQ phone 1 to Site B phone 1. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can hear that call is ringing there. And like I said, let me go back and show you. This is really all you need technically, but that doesn't allow you to get granular with it. If you want to point different route strings to different clusters, which is probably what you're going to want to do, then you're going to have to configure it with the specific route string that you're using. Good question, though. I appreciate that. Next question that I have built up here. Mike asks, do I need to have intercluster routing using directory numbers in order to support URI dialing between clusters? Do I need to have intercluster routing using directory numbers in order to support URI? Okay, I see what you're asking here. So URI dialing between clusters, you don't have to have. You don't have to have directory number dialing. I'll show you here. If we go to our SIP trunks, they're two separate SIP trunks. You can see, one's for DNs, one's for URIs. But we could even go as far as to, let's not. I was going to delete it, but let's just point it to a non-existent IP. All right, so now that normal SIP trunk that's used to dial to the other cluster is down. So let's go ahead and show that. Still have that call up there. And we ended the call there. So if I dialed to 2001, it shouldn't work because we've pointed that SIP trunk to another location. So if I go 2001 and hit the dial soft key, it took a little while, but I got a fast busy, which, as I already mentioned, is the worst sound you can hear. All right, so that is not working anymore. But if I were to use a URI to dial to site B phone 1, 2, 3, 4, fourth button, I can hit that, and now that call is successful because it's using a different SIP trunk to get there. So just because you've got URI because you've got a directory number dialing configured, doesn't mean that URI dialing will work or won't work. They're completely independent of each other, or they can be. Sometimes you might even use the same SIP trunk to support URI dialing and directory number dialing. In a lot of cases, you probably will do that. So it looks like that's all the questions I had today. So I want to thank you again for coming out. I really appreciate the support and the questions, and I feel like we had a pretty great discussion here today. So once again, any questions, let me know. I'll be available, and thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you next week.